Hey guys, it's Leila from Ignite, and I'm here with Jonny.
What up,
And
guys?
hey Jonny, in today's
Hello.
video, we're going to be going through the HSC text for human experience, and we're going to be linking them to the current COVID-19 circumstances and drawing on potential links between our world now and what was going on in the worlds of those writers. And at the end of the clip, we're also going to give a little bit of advice on how to best approach study during this kind of self-isolation process. But before we get into it, please do like and subscribe to our channel and click the bell for notifications. Anything to add, Jonny?
That's it. Please make sure you do subscribe right now, those who don't forget. We are trying to move towards our 5K target this year. And we do appreciate all the watches and recommendations.
And the
And we
comments.
begin, yeah, go on, sorry.
And the comments as well, we appreciate those too.
Yeah, so we're getting a lot of feedback, a lot of action going on. So it's exciting to see, when you're producing these things, the feedback and the continual engagement. So we're feeling good about the channel. We're just going to
Building
keep
of
growing it.
despite everybody being kept in isolation, which is quite nice.
What's that?
The building of the Ignite community despite everybody being kept in
Yes,
isolation.
that's right. That's right. We've got to keep growing.
Growing. Anyway, maybe we should start off with just a quick little recap of some of the overarching features of our current context before drawing on specific connections to be drawn to the texts.
Sure.
So one thing that we want to flag, so the current COVID-19 situation legislation which has been put in place has led to, I guess, a greater sense of control that our executive can enact on individuals. We've been isolated, kept in our homes, and there is a general kind of fragmentation and a disintegration of society in the wake of fear and vulnerability, which we touched on in our previous video on COVID-19. So, Jonny, is there anything you wanted to add on framing?
I was going to say, and paradoxically, we've got that situation going on, but paradoxically, there's an element of and a feeling of solidarity going on at the moment. You see, shifts in how people speak about, social distancing. It's now physical distancing, right? So the language is changing a little bit to kind of embrace that solidarity and that collective experience, that unified experience that we are all confronting together. So there's a sense of togetherness, but ironically, in the togetherness, if you really are going to embrace it, you actually have to be isolated physically. So the solidarity is felt kind of invisibly. It's intangible, right? It's intangible, but it's still certainly very powerful, and it can really unite us and lead to some new frontiers in terms of how we progress as a society, technologically and economically. So there's some light at the end of the tunnel, I think, here. But I think there are some interesting tensions for sure. And that obviously interesting one is the tension between individual agency, freedom of movement, freedom of ideas, freedom of everything, versus the government telling you to stay right where you are, and that basically we have to relinquish all control over those freedoms that we truly value and give that up to the government. We have to entrust them with that, and there comes a risk there. So, interesting tension for all of us.
And the fact that we're all unified by our collective vulnerability to this sickness, this COVID-19 sickness, which we spoke about in depth in our video, considering how it's intangible, it's abstract, it cannot be personified, and very paradoxically, as Jonny has rightly framed, we have to be in isolation in order to unify or collectively try and fight against this disease. So Jonny touched on some really important points. And I think what is also elucidated in this context is that we had so many liberties towards which we may previously have been unaware, right? In the sense that I didn't really think that going to the park or exercising or going to the gym was something that I would have to relinquish in order to fight something that is so powerful and powerful against any individual, irrespective of gender or race. Or social class, and the list goes on. So I think that's really the hallmarks of the context, right? That we have relinquished our liberties, that we've handed over a lot of our trust in our government, who is now exercising a really quite ubiquitous level of control, and that we're constantly being watched. We've had, I guess, examples in the news of our data being used to track our locations. There are, I guess, talks of drones being used to trace our whereabouts, increased, I guess, police existence in societies and in communities. So there's this sense of permanent visibility, constantly being watched, all to hopefully be used to fight against the disease. But of course it raises the questions, or at least the texts that we've studied have raised the questions of what can happen when we entrust our governments with so much control and control over our liberties, our freedom and our agency. So lots of interesting questions to, I think, be raised.
For sure.
Nice.
And I think that is a nice segue into the text. One thing we should raise that we mentioned in the last video, for those of you who watched the whole thing, is that sense of meta awareness that you kind of get from this video itself. It's kind of a nice final touch on what you just said, because when we did look at those texts, they did warn and caution us against, this power that can be exploited and abused by the people in whom we trust our confidence and our own autonomy, and we really give that to the government. And ironically, the text itself, by kind of illuminating those issues, is actually helping fight against those issues. So us talking about this is really about keeping the awareness there. We're keeping the questioning going. It's not that we thinking there's some crazy, we're not conspiracy theorists here. We don't think something crazy is happening, although there's lots of those out there as well. But you know what? It's good that there's lots of voices out there being, critical and scrutinizing the ins and outs of what's actually going on, the necessity of what's going on, given the freedoms that are at stake. So, it's great that we're doing this video and kind of celebrating the freedom we have, at least here, to voice any potential concerns that we may have, or that other people may have, over what's going on in the current environment.
Such an important point. Like, as we intertextually engage with authors such as Orwell and Miller, who were themselves speaking out against government control. We're not saying that we're being as profound as those writers, but by virtue of us creating this own text, right, because the video itself is a text in a very metatextual way, we're trying to continue that dialogue about being conscious, questioning. And I guess one point that we should really add here is, of course, the levels of control that are in place now are important and they have a place. But I guess what Miller and Orwell and other writers would want us to consider is what's going to happen when COVID-19 is an issue, and are these levels of control going to change? Because if they don't, that's when you can really see some connections between what's happening now and what happened in the post-war context and during the Salem witch trials and all of those other periods that we'll now open a bit of dialogue on.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's we're careful of that shift from pragmatic and kind of legitimate justifications for the use of power, and then that moving into that dangerous territory where it becomes ideological power for the sake of power. So
right.
You might not view it as a timeline, and right now it seems to be kind of legitimized by the present situation. But then as you move on, you've got to think, is the power that is being exercised, is that being directed towards a legitimate threat? And you just got to kind of keep that awareness the whole way along.
Is it reasonable use of power for a particular purpose, and a purpose that is explicated in the legislation and are there means of checking it, which they currently are, because we do live in a democracy. We've got these separations of arms of governments and so on. But when that becomes blurred and manifest and too much power is given to the executive and it's not judged, that's when it becomes an issue, which is the kind of power we actually get in 1984, which is the infallible sort of power for the sake of power. So I don't know, do you want to start off with 1984, Johnny? Should we segue into that?
Yeah, we should go into the text, because we'll just keep riffing on the preamble. Excuse me.
another video.
Yeah, that's right. So let's go into 1984.
Sure.
So connections to 1984 with the COVID-19 crisis, let's call it. What are your present thoughts?
Yeah, so the first thing that comes to mind, when you just said power for the sake of power, or the notion of infallible power, of course, in 1984, the only reasoning for the power which takes place is purely to disenfranchise the individual and to reinstate the value of Big Brother as a totalitarian leader. So there's no actual productive force behind the power there. So that's a distinguishing feature between what happens in 1984 and what's happening in our own context now. And part of the way that Big Brother's, I guess, surveillance of society is reinforced is by individuals checking up on each other, surveying one another, and dobbing in people who aren't obeying by Big Brother's standards. And I think we see that in today's society, right? People are so now conscious of people who are congregating. There's that really great meme that's going around. I don't know, Johnny, if you've seen it, with Kim Kardashian on the phone, and it's like me ringing the police when I see 3 people at the park. So we have this kind of sense of, what was that?
I haven't seen that particular one, Kimmy K.
There's a lot out there which is kind of comically making a comment on individuals feeling this now obligation to call out other individuals who aren't abiding by the legislation, which is very much so what was happening in Orwell's context with Hitler Youth. And we actually see that in the example of Parsons, who was dobbed in by his own actual child in 1984. So that's a nice kind of specific example to drawn in the text. So yeah, community surveillance, infallible power being something that's a distinguishing factor, but of course this greater sense of power that's been given to the executive, which the individuals are now being subject to.
Yeah, that's right. And just to expand on a couple of those, this idea that just going to the human experience as language, paradoxes here where we're told that, as part of our social responsibility and as part of beating this problem together, right, we have to actually turn each other in. You can see the clear paradox there, that actually what you're doing by turning others in is you actually are alienating each other. We're alienating each other, and therefore we are becoming weaker as a collective. We don't have this full strength of the collective in case power starts to become abused or exploited, right? So we give power to the government. They tell us this is what you need to do, and it sounds legitimate given again, pragmatic, where we're in the practical circumstances where actual physical separation is a necessity. But by telling people to actually start dobbing each other in, then we're starting to approach that dangerous line where actually you're alienating people against each other. People aren't feeling unified, notwithstanding that a lot of people are. Remember that the different pockets of society are affected differently, and because we have that solidarity, that overwhelming solidarity in this kind of alienated situation that we are in, physically at least. And there is that paradox that we have to be cautious of, right? So, yes, sorry.
No, I was just going to say that that's so true, because as soon as you have a sense of unity within the society, it kind of then forces the government to relinquish a little bit of their power, because there is more power to the people, which is why in 1984 there is so much made of the fact that individuals cannot have meaningful and loving relationships. All love and even desire is meant to be projected towards Big Brother to safeguard his control. So that's where we can see a little bit of a reflection of what was happening in 1984 in our own world. We're turning individuals away from one another. But of course, in our own world, we're still able to remain united within our family units, provided you're living at the same location. So there's a little bit of a kind of similarity, but difference there that can be.
Yeah, that's right. I just thought of something there with, the Julia Winston connection, because we know that Winston isn't meant to see Julia in the way he does romantically. Funnily enough, the New South Wales regulations still allow you to see your partner, right? It's under that. Yeah, so we're not quite there. We're not at the Julia Winston kind of rebellion stage where it will literally be illegal to go and see a boyfriend, girlfriend, or someone who's not living in the same house, because you're still allowed the one person. So it's a funny connection there, that we're not quite at the Big Brother level, and that's one kind of metric to justify that, right?
Right. The government isn't trying to enforce a sense of lacking love and care and compassion towards other individuals. They're still telling us that we can be compassionate, although
yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's interesting as well, because when you look at the wording of the legislation, it uses the word, I think, care, right? Care for care. I didn't know if it uses compassion as well, is it?
Yeah, the 16th reasons, there's 16 different categories. The final one is compassionate reasons. So, for example, if you're going to drop off groceries to your grandmother who can't go to the grocery store herself, that would be considered a compassionate reason. And Mick Fuller, the police commissioner, did himself come forward and say that you are allowed to go and see your romantic partner, that wasn't prohibited in the legislation. So that's considered to be a compassionate reason.
That's right. That's right. So, that's an interesting distinguishing feature there. Because the government's not telling us that we should suppress in some kind of way our desire, our romantic desires, our affections for our family. They're saying to stay close, but there is that, again, tension. Stay 1.5 meters apart, even in your own house, right? For the good of the people. There is still a slight tension there as well, right? When you're in the house, you're still meant to kind of keep distance as best you can. As far as I know, you're still meant to kind of, even with your family, be careful, right?
Yeah, there is a sense that you have this collective accountability to constantly be washing your hands, to keep a distance and to try and spread the disease, even if self-isolating. So I don't know, on a personal level, it has made me kind of really conscious of who I come into contact with, even in my own house. We're constantly using antibacterial soap. There's this sense that even within your own home, you're not protected from this abstract, not personifiable disease. So it really has changed, I think, the format of relationships, even in a quarantined household. So yeah, it's a very complex time.
Yeah, definitely. And on that, I was just trying to think of the nature, how we can connect the coronavirus as like kind of the source, the threat, right?
Yeah.
So so I was going to say it's kind of the invisible other. Not only is the other potentially each other in the worst case, But actually the kind of threat or the point that they're kind of leveraging, that the government is leveraging potentially, leveraging, I'm using that loosely, is that there's basically this virus, this thing you can't see, and it's fear though. It creates a sense of fear. So there is that leverage point there, that is the source of the power for those who have the power. So the government, in our case, the executive. And if we go look at Big Brother, right? If we look at 1984, I should say, and we look at Big Brother, like who do they try and instill fear towards for the collective, right?
Go on. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say that it kind of has many parts, right? They do the 2 minutes of hate, don't they?
Yeah, so there is the sense of collective fear against an other, which is the East Asia, Eurasia, and the constant wars, which is wavering between them. But I just wanted
macro fear.
Yeah, the macro fear. But I just wanted to add as well, I think we do kind of refer to COVID as not personified, but we do really try to personify it within certain groups of people in society. So we do still direct hate towards certain categories of people. So I think it started off initially with just having this really awful racist hatred towards Asians in general. And then we've got, of course, the people who've come in on boats, right? The people who've been on the cruise ships. Mm-hmm. Then you've got at Bondi Beach. So there has been certain hate. Yeah, okay, we're all kind of unified and trying to warn off this disease, but we have also manifested this want to personify who do we blame for the disease towards certain groups of people in the same way that hate was channeled towards the East Asia and Eurasia and Big Brother. So that's an interesting parallelism which can be drawn in the same way. But as you rightly point out, it's very complex, the nature of the hate in Big Brother. It's not only hate towards the other nation, but also this fear that lingers within society amongst other individuals who may be contravening the rules of Big Brother, which I guess you wanted to go on to explore there.
Yeah, that's right. The more micro individual hate that is kind of encouraged and actually almost forced, right, with things like the 2 minute hate, where you are forced to and move all your passion away from, again, like the love for your family and friends. You're redirecting all your passion. So no sexual desire in that text either, but redirecting all of the passion into hate towards individuals who are contravening the rules, who are going against the status quo. And we know that Big Brother doesn't want anyone to go against the status quo. So let's turn everyone against the people who are doing that. And also simultaneously what's going on is the whole passion thing as well. You are kind of, every time you do that, you're doing what Big Brother wants. You're reinforcing that power. You're actually further perpetuating that power.
That's right. So it's a very kind of interesting way Big Brother realizes that as individuals, as beings, we're visceral. We have emotions within us, and the emotions of anger and desire or love are actually quite intertwined in a way because they're passions, right? They're passionate emotions. So instead of having those passionate, loving emotions towards an intimate other, it's channeled as kind of, and it's cathartic and it's purged out as hate towards the enemy, but then also this very kind of warped sense of love towards Big Brother. And we know that there's a lot of kind of sexual images of Big Brother almost kind of raping the individual with his ideology throughout the text, and some of the quotes, filling you with ourselves, giving you the way of the 2 + 2 = 5, to try and indoctrinate the individual.
Also isn't it the tooth getting yanked out or something like that?
The frustration, of the tooth being pulled out. That's when Winston has been in room 101 and he's tortured into believing the ideology of Big Brother. So I think actually going over those specific parts of the text are really important because they remind us that we're not in that extent of a dystopian world, but on a broader thematic level, I think you can use some of the elements of what's happening in our own world, i.e. the isolation, the sense of permanent visibility, the surveillance, the, greater sense of executive power, in order to deeper connect with the anomalies and the challenges and the emotions which arose in 1984. So when you're going about your studies, you can kind of use this moment of reflection to better empathize with the transcending and enduring values of what George Orwell was raising in 1984.
Yeah, that's right. Well said. So I think one of the key things we've highlighted there from the rubric is that emotional dissonance, right? The emotional polarization that can be leveraged. And I think we commented on in part 1 in our first video on this, is how this experience is basically showing us the best and the worst of ourselves. It exposes the weaknesses and also the strengths of humanity, and we can see that manifest emotionally. So when you see people reach out to others, we see the compassion of health workers, people on the front line, people who are trying to quickly get together and find the vaccine. Anyone who's involved in the process, actually putting themselves at risk. We see the best of our humanity. We see people reaching out and making sure that people have someone to talk to. et cetera, et cetera. But then we also see people demonizing others. We see people dobbing people in or when we see people doing it for the wrong reasons, and also, you know, directing racist remarks at people and kind of stigmatizing individuals, you know, which isn't helped by, you know, especially when higher up political figures are doing that as well. It can certainly exacerbate those causes. You know, I think what it was Trump calls it the Chinese virus, right? And like that kind of language can certainly worsen the problem.
That's right. In fact, little clips of him went viral about, you know, framing that the virus came from China, which is rightly so, but it's the symbolic kind of rendering of it as a Chinese disease, which is obviously deeply underpinned with racism. But yeah, I think that's pretty much all of the links, or at least an overview of the links that we can draw to 84. We've discussed, you know, this arising of anomaly in human experience, how that can expose elements of your character to which you weren't previously aware, these notions of the paradoxes of human experience, the individual elements and the collective and how they intermix through this, notions of power, authority, agency, desire, passion, emotion. There are so many elements on. But I think what you really want to take away from what we've said is how you can use your contemporary circumstances to better understand the, I guess, perennial questions of human existence, and how when you study these texts, the reason they remain of continuing value is because there are so many allusions they draw to future context. They're quite prophetic in that way.
Yeah, and that's right. And there's also, I just had a thought as well about that, the differing degrees of, you know, power that have been displayed within that text and our present context. And you know, it's interesting to see how individuals respond to when freedoms are taken away from them, because we know that in Big Brother's context, almost everyone, you know, even Winston at the end, when he finally kind of cedes to that power, basically everyone in that text, especially the proles, right, embodied that collective, that unconscious collective. We know that paradox, right? You can't rebel unless you're conscious, and you can't become conscious unless you rebel. That they're really stuck in that state. And but it's interesting, in our context, we're not in that state. We're not oblivious to what's going on. And when we saw kind of when those restrictions first came in, you know, around Australia and in New South Wales, we see how people respond. And you know, the Bondi Beach example, right? People take away the freedom, but you can't hold us back, right? Like people will want to rebel. There's that instinctive, it's in our nature, right? It's instinctive to want something that is taken away from you, especially when it concerns your freedom. And you see the dangerous kind of endpoint when power is abused and exploited to such an extent, and you're manipulated to such an extent and brainwashed that you can't even see yourself being exploited, and then you lose that instinct. And we know that those instinctive desires in Big Brother actually were pretty much dissipated for everyone. You know, bar Winston and Julia, we see their kind of sexual primal instincts still manifest, but they're eventually punished for that until the point where they actually hate each other. But pulling it back to us, we see that, you know, human nature is that we instinctively do want to hold on to our freedoms as much as we can. And you'll see people trying to bend the rules or find any, not necessarily bend the rules, but just find any spots to keep that, to preserve that freedom and to exercise that freedom as best they can.
Yeah, so I guess the point there is that we're all still Winston and Julia before they become discovered in the attic, right? So we still have that sense of consciousness about us. Of course, we're responding to circumstances. And that element of consciousness, I think, will also be a nice segue into Arthur Miller's The Crucible, because what he wanted more than anything else was for individuals to continue to question and to remain conscious of the powers to which they're being subject. I guess one point that we should probably caveat is that we haven't really looked at Orwell's actual context, his historical world, and what gave rise to him context, because I think that there is obviously what was happening in his own world sparked the distortions and the dystopic elements that he plays out in 1984. But I think in your own studies, it's important to kind of think about what was happening in Orwell's world, which gave rise to him representing human experience in the way that he did. And there are some implied links that can be created between the post-World War II era and what we're experiencing now in terms of how much control was in place then versus our own kind of period.